So I'm going to give you an overview of community rights organizing. So the We the People 2.0 was put together by the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund and the Community Rights Movement, and I want to explain to you a little bit about this. So basically we live in a corporate state, as you see, and the solution to that is not going to be someone else. There's going to be no superhero coming to save us. There's going to be no super politician or Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman. It's not happening. And the reason is because the corporations need to make a profit in order to continue to survive. And they will do that because they have more rights than we do. And so we end up with these corporate harms. The corporate harm comes into our community and it looks pretty innocent at first unless you identify it some other way. You'll see some official looking guy in a business suit come in and negotiate with you and hold a hearing, and the next thing you know, your whole community is being poisoned. And so there are those of us who take it upon ourselves when something really bad is happening and we know it's the truth. We take it upon ourselves. We become outraged and we want to take it on as a project. And that's a rare person, but I would say 1% of us are in that category right now. So we have this desire to say no. It could be fracking, it could be the destruction of the St. Vrain River Valley. You know, it could be, spraying pesticides in the forest around your community to beat back weeds, for tree farming, extraction of water out from underneath your aquifer, all sorts of things, all sorts of corporate harms. So we say, no, we're not going to have this. This is immoral. This is just too obvious. We just need to let people know how this is really happening to them and appeal to our politicians, our elected officials, and ask for help. And we become very disturbed when they tell us that they can't do anything to help us. And so we start off saying no, and then if we are going along the script that's laid out for us by the corporate state, we'll take a detour from saying no. And we'll go into what we call the regulatory system. So now we'll start trying to negotiate with corporations to try and be nice to them and make deals with them so they don't hurt us as bad. And this is what you see in Erie right now. A corporate agreement is a memorandum of understanding. And basically it's an agreement of the terms under which you're going to be poisoned. And so that's one thing that people try. And negotiating with corporations, very difficult. They may give you a few crumbs, like instead of putting it 200 feet from your house, maybe they'll put it 500 feet from your house, but you're still going to get it. The other thing is zoning, and they play these little tricks to try and prohibit industrial activities in certain areas of the town. But the reality is that zoning is there to apportion off these areas. It's not there to prohibit anything from going on. So the corporate harm comes in anyway if you're trying to play zoning tricks. Now there's another thing that we call the regulatory chute. And this is part of the corporate script that puts us in a position where we march and protest and wave signs and have sit-ins and show up and we testify at hearings. So the regulatory chute, we call it a chute because it's kind of like a cattle chute, where a big herd is herded into a ever-increasing confinement until there's a point of elimination. And that's what's happening to most of us if we're following the conventional routes to activism. So let's talk about the regulatory chute. You have the corporate harm, there's your chute, and communities go into the chute saying no, and then they realize that the conversation has changed by the authorities into focusing on negotiating the rate and extent of the harm rather than eliminating it. You can't It's not about saying no. So when we ask our local officials, they tell us to go to a hearing about this and testify about how bad the harm is. You know, the state, if we go to our state representatives, they'll send us to a hearing. Our culture has us prepared to go to hearings. And you know what a hearing is. You go and speak before the commissioner or the counselors. You get 3, 5 minutes, whatever it is, and you get to tell your sob story. Your lawyer, if you have an environmental lawyer, they'll tell you to go to a hearing. The corporation themselves, when you negotiate with them, they'll tell you to go to a hearing. The media wants you to go to a hearing. And if you sign up with an environmental group, that's what they're really good at, is taking you to a hearing. When you go to the hearing, eventually when you hear it so much, we begin to think, we should really go to that hearing. So we go to the hearing. And what happens is that we end up going down this chute and finding out that the conversation really isn't about prohibiting, it's about regulating the rate and extent of the destruction. Our whole legal system and governmental system is set up this way. So then the original problem, which was, no, we're not doing this, is now defined by the corporate state and not by us, and not by our communities. And so the regulations are discussed, and the harms of those activities are legalized by issuing permits, and then it becomes a legal use, and then it happens to us. So when we go through this regulatory chute, we've invested a lot of time usually into the campaign. We've recruited tons of volunteers, tons of money has been donated. We've got all kinds of signs and banners and everything all that we've done. We're basically exhausted by the time we get to the bottom of that chute. And then we realize that the commission that's, you know, where we're appearing is going to do it anyway. And then that's the single regulatory point, and that's where the cattle bolt gets slammed into the head of the cow, all right? So we say no, there's a detour, we go corporate agreements, zoning, or we go through the regulatory chute. This is called the regulatory system. And this is what we do here in this country. We regulate, we control the amount of destruction, but we still destroy. And you can't say no in the regulatory system. You get to say how much and how many, all right? So you can't say no. And so the community rights activism is about abolishing the corporate state ultimately, because we believe in local community self-government. And we believe there's a good strategy, we believe there's a good strategy for establishing local community self-government. And it first has to do with your understanding of how the system works. So it's a way of doing what's called rights-based organizing. So what are rights? Well, rights are primordial. They were here before you arrived, and they'll be here after you leave. They are inalienable. You can't sell them, you can't inherit them, you can't gift them. They're just there. They're fundamental, they're universal, they're eternal, and they're absolute. Rights are really the organizing of nature. And nature has rights to exist and to flourish, just like we do. So when we are engaged in rights-based organizing, we have a different system of law that confronts the existing establishment. So here we have this, well, right there is a square. This is what we're going to call the Box of Allowable Activism. So there's your community inside this box. And there's a lot of pressure to keep your community contained within the box. And those are basic legal doctrines that are used in the courts to give the corporations what they want. So Dillon's rule is basically that our communities are children of the state. We can't do anything without permission. You know, if we want to go to the bathroom, we have to raise our hand, and they tell us we can go, and they give us a hall pass, and then we go. And you know, you can't, your not supposed to be able to write laws of your own to protect yourself, to give yourself greater rights or greater freedoms than that given to you by the state. Then you have state preemption, which is a expression of Dillon's rule that says that if we have a Colorado Oil and Gas Act that was passed by the legislators as a statutory law, that basically the way they're using preemption is that it supersedes our constitutional right to initiative and to adopting laws of our own within our own community, so that we can't regulate fracking or gravel mining ourselves. The state regulates it, and so we can't set any regulations more than the state sets for us. Corporate and personhood and corporate constitutional rights are there to keep corporations happy so that they can do commerce across state lines and they can make a profit. So if you screw around with a corporation's right to make a profit, they get really upset and they sue you for their loss. The other problem with environmental activism is that nature is considered property. It's not, it doesn't have rights. You can buy it, you can sell it. The more property, more nature you own, the more nature you can destroy. And so that's a big problem. As long as nature is property, there's no way we can protect it because it belongs to a private individual. The corporate commerce rights, basically, you can do business across state lines. So these are the doctrines they use when you try and pass an initiative like Longmont did, for instance, or Lafayette, or Fort Collins, or Broomfield. We think that we have this ability to do initiative to ban things or to moratoriumize them or however we do them. And we really don't, because these doctrines are set in place to stop us from having any right to local self-government, any legal right to local self-government. Now, the next thing I want to do is talk to you about community bills of rights. So those circles are concentric for a reason. These are layers of protection. So community bills of rights are documents that we write as a community that clarify and enumerate our rights. The right to clean air, clean water, freedom from chemical trespass, the right to local self-government, the right to prohibit things that violate those rights, the right to enforce those prohibitions. So that's a community bill of rights, and many of us have been involved in writing those throughout the community rights movement. And so when we do this, what it does is creates layers of protection so that it shuts down Dillon's rule, it shuts down state preemption, it shuts down the commerce rule, clause, and it shuts down corporate personhood, and it turns nature into life and not into property. So we adopt these laws on our own. So we can do it through initiative. We can approach our council people or our commissioners and they can adopt them on our behalf. You can also adopt them without any particular, you can adopt them as a community without your government adopting them. And you can enforce those yourself if you want, because these are inalienable rights. So you have to have these local laws in place to clearly define your demands when you're organizing. And when you have the local laws in place, whether they're officially recorded as laws in your town or county or state, you can still enforce them. So enforcement is the big issue here. So typically the elected officials are working on behalf of the corporate state, and they don't want to have any laws restricting these big corporations, keeping them from coming in and making their big profits. They've been meeting with these people for a long time. They're friends, and there's probably some fringe benefits that they're gaining from being nice to these big corporations. So enforcement is a big issue. Now, we can enforce them by allowing our communities to enforce the laws, but we can enforce them ourselves. So we recommend that when you write your local laws, you put a really strong enforcement clause in there that's saying that your local elected officials don't enforce it, that you can. and that direct action enforcement is legal in your community. If your community, if your officials won't adopt these things as law, or you adopt them through initiative and then they get preempted by the state of Colorado, you know, you can still enforce them. You can still make these demands the basis of your direct action campaigns. And they're very powerful because this is a proactive way of creating what you want rather than resisting what you don't want. I never said the word resist until now. This is creative manifestation. This is creating a new world. You can't create a new world by resisting the horrible world that already exists. By resisting, all you're doing is making it more powerful. All right, so you basically get what you don't want. You should go for what you want. That's my philosophy in life anyway. We require a people's movement to pull this off. It's not going to be a few people that do this. It's going to be everybody that does this. It has to be a revolt. And when we have a people's movement, it requires the collective effort of many people and the end of begging for reform, and in the beginning of uncompromising exertion of community power. The unerring goal of securing and enforcing fundamental rights and the removal of systemic violations of those rights. So what I suggest is that during our discussion, we might want to talk a little bit about inalienable rights and about enforcement of those rights. So we'll have time afterwards. Josh, you next?